Thank you for choosing Reeves Professional Education Services. Please follow all directions as you take this course. Make sure to take notes for the test at the end of the class. You must spend a minimum of 50 minutes to receive credit for this course. You will be given 3 attempts to pass the exam. Good luck, and let's get started.
Learning objectives in this course include how to properly fill out a wood-destroying insect report, or more commonly known as a termite letter, the sections that are included in the report, when you're going to need to recommend treatment, how damage factors in, and how to write up the obstructions and inaccessible areas on the report. Let's take a look at Section 1 on the report. Section 1 is pretty self-explanatory. You're going to need to make sure you date the report. You're also going to need to make sure you put your business license number on the report and detail the structure inspected. Also make sure that you sign in the areas you need to sign in and put your certification number as well, as this is required in most states. Here's an example of Section 1 on the Wood Destroying Insect Report. First off, you can see there's a section there for you to put your company name and address. That would be the upper left there in the white box that's shaded with the red line. You see the big red arrow there. To the right of that is going to be the address of the property inspected, which also has a big area next to it. And then in the upper right hand corner, you see the red arrow that's kind of longer and skinnier that says date of inspection. This obviously is going to be the date that you inspect the structure. Below that is the inspector's name, signature, certification, registration, and/or license number. It's important to note that you need to fill out your name in print as well as sign this area, and then put your certification or registration number based on which state you're in. Just to the right of that, it says structures inspected. This is another area we need to fill in. You may not just look at a house. This may be a building, maybe a house, maybe a detached garage, maybe a shed. So just keep in mind this is the area for you put the structures inspected on the property. Once we get into Section 2, things get a little bit more interesting. This is where you're going to put down your inspection findings. A is going to be no visible evidence of wood-destroying insects was found. That's great. If you can mark this area, it's going to make the rest of your report a whole lot easier. And we're working for the buyers now in most states in the real estate deals, so more often than not, we'd obviously, for their sake and everybody involved, like to not find evidence. B gets a little bit more interesting when we look at the visible evidence of wood-destroying insects was found. We've got 3 subsections by that: live insects, description, location of; dead insects, insect parts, frass, shelter tubes, exit holes, and staining. The third subpoint under B is visible damage from wood-destroying insects was noted as follows. That section gets a lot more interesting in my mind. Now we've got obviously either some live insects, which if we find live insects, I think it can be pretty easy to go ahead and recommend treatment. You're going to need to note the description and location because that's what it says on the form. So keep in mind when you're filling this out that if you're going to put live insects, put on your graph where you found them. The company I owned for years, we used a graph that actually had a code ST for subterranean termites, and I would draw my graph of the structure, and if I found live evidence, I would put ST with a circle around it. How many of you have had the real estate agent call you and say, well, you found termites, where were they at? Well, take a look at my graph and then you'll be able to see. I marked right on the graph with an ST and a circle that there were subterranean termites. Let's say they were in the garage, whatever the case may be. So this is something that's a little bit for your protection, as well as kind of lets the people involved in the transaction know exactly what you found. Point number 2 under B is a little bit more interesting, as it says dead insects, insect parts, frass, shelter tubes, exit holes, and staining. This is very interesting to me. I love the word staining. What does staining mean? Staining is when there's been previous termite tubes on a block foundation or on a wall or in a garage area or something like that, and you can tell the termite tubes have been removed. Do you recommend treatment with staining? That's a question I get asked a lot, and there's no steadfast rule on it. Do you see any evidence of termite treatment on the home? You know, maybe it was treated a couple years ago, it was drilled out, and they removed the tubes, they just didn't scrub it off. Staining is very subjective. Depends who you are. You as the inspector are going to have to decide if you think the structure needs treatment or not. I always say if I see staining, shelter tubes, frass, insect parts, dead insects, whatever, if there's no evidence of it being treated within the last year, you probably need to go ahead and recommend treatment just because it covers you. Because you very easily could end up in court and having to explain why you didn't recommend treatment, but you saw the staining. Looking at shelter tubes, there's another very interesting one. Shelter tubes, do we recommend treatment or not? Well, if there's no termites in them, I think most realtors want you to go ahead and pass it on through and say, hey, you know what, there was some shelter tubes, but there's no live termites in them. How much do you know about termites, though? If it's too hot or too cold, what do the termites do? They actually go down in the ground, because those shelter tubes are going to be connected to the colony in the ground anyways. They'll go back down in those shelter tubes to get away from the extremes. So truly, the termites may just not be in the shelter tubes at any given time. Last January, where I live, it went down to 0 degrees. Well, I could have easily been inspecting a crawl space, seen 5 or 6 shelter tubes, broke them open, and seen no activity. It was so cold, everybody's pipes were freezing and busting and everything. So the termites are going to try to get away from the extreme conditions. So just because you see shelter tubes doesn't necessarily mean you have to recommend treatment, but you do need to be wise about it and think it through. I would probably suggest recommending treatment at most times with shelter tubes just to protect yourself from liability, and I truly do believe there can be activity even if you don't see it in the tubes. Dead insects, insect parts, and frass, I think that would be more towards the carpenter ant side or the carpenter bee side, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what types of things you're going to need to include on the report. But most of you know carpenter ants will kind of eject dead insects from their colony. They actually chew through the wood and make their colony or burrow down into the wood. And they don't actually eat the wood, they chew it up and kind of spit the frass out. So that's where you're going to see the dead insects kind of being ejected from the nest, or you might even still see them in the nest if they haven't ejected them yet. The frass is going to be more either carpenter ants or carpenter bees. How many of you see carpenter bees on a regular basis in your area? They're pretty common where I'm at. I think they're pretty common throughout the southeast and probably even as far north as the Ohio River area. So real common carpenter bees. You're going to see the frass, kind of the nice little dime-sized shaped holes. The frass, again, is just where they're chewing up into the wood, trying to make a nest. They're not eating the wood, but they are damaging it, so it is something you need to include on the report. Exit holes are another good one. Exit holes could be any type of beetle. I think a common one, obviously, is the powder post beetle that a lot of us see. That's another one where you're going to have to take a look. Do you see any frass below the holes? Do you feel like they're active? Again, is there any evidence that this has been treated within the past year? If not, you may want to go ahead and recommend treatment on the exit holes. It's for your protection and the buyer's protection in the real estate deal. So we're looking a little bit further. We get into visible damage from wood destroying insects was noted as follows. Here's another important one. Visible damage was noted, but what does visible damage mean? I don't know. It depends, but obviously we've all seen termite damage. But you know, as soon as you put visible damage, you're going to have a realtor calling you and going, how bad is the damage? Is it structural? The next line on our letter here says, this is not a structural damage report. So anytime you're dealing with a situation where there could be some structural damage or there's any damage at all, you don't really need to answer if it's structural or not because you're not qualified to tell them that. I mean, they need to get a structural engineer or at least a home inspector or somebody who has a little bit more training to explain if this is structural damage or not. So obviously we do have to note there is damage. Again, we need to put the description and location on the damage, any of the exit hole staining shelter tubes, and I didn't mention that on the last point, but any of these, you're going to need to put a description and location. So once again, make sure in your graph you note that the visible damage was in this area. Do not go down the slippery slope of trying to explain to people the damage. You're not a structural engineer. Most of you are not even home inspectors. And it's just opening up a can of worms. You really don't have to, because this document protects you from having to answer those questions. The next point in section 2 is, it appears that the structure was treated previously, yes or no. Make sure you fill this out correctly, and then there's a line beside it to note what type of treatment you've seen. So if you see a monitoring system around the outside, you could say yes, monitoring system was installed. Or if you see drill marks around the slabs or in the garage, you can say yes, drill marks around the slab, garage, whatever the case may be. Remember, there is another protection built in this section that says you are not guaranteeing any work by others, and that company is going to need to be contacted about the work they did. So even if you see drill markings, you see holes, whatever the case may be, you don't know what type of work they did, what product they use. You might be able to look at it and say, well, the holes are drilled 12 inches apart, as most insect labels say, or termiticides say, but you can't really assure them that it was done right or anything else about the treatment. So keep in mind, this is your protection right here that says you don't have to deal with that. They need to contact the company that did the work, or if it's unknown, then they're just going to have to let it go, because again, there's no assurances that you can do not being the company that did the work. And this is our actual image of section 2. You see the nice little light blue arrow at the top. This section 2 starts by saying this report is indicative of the condition of the above identified structures on the date of inspection and is not to be construed as a guarantee or warranty against latent, concealed, or future infestations or defects. This is going to be based on a careful visual inspection of the readily accessible areas of the structures inspected. So we're going to review again what we just talked about, but this line's very interesting to me. It says this is not a guarantee or warranty against latent, concealed, or future infestations. I think what that means in a nutshell is, obviously, a future infestation, this letter is going to be good for 90 days, so we got to remember that. Now, if your state law is different, that's fine too. I think most states is 90 days, so you definitely want to check into your state laws. Latent or concealed termites is another big issue. I inspected a house several years ago. It's actually in Tennessee near where I live, and I saw all these totes stacked up in one area of the garage. I didn't think much about it when I was there, but I went ahead and wrote it on my report and said, hey, I can't view this wall of the garage. But wouldn't you know it, about 5 weeks later, the new homeowners called me up and said, hey, we got major termites in our garage and you did the inspection. You gave us a 90-day guarantee. Fortunately, what I had done was I had written up the obstruction, took a picture of it, and put it in the report just in case something like this happened. We're going to talk more as we go into section 4 about obstructions in inaccessible areas. But remember, if somebody conceals something latently or stacks something up in the corner, you can't be liable for that, because this letter does give you protection on that. As you look down, the pink arrow, again, we talked about, A, there's no visible evidence, wood destroying insects, everything's great. The green arrow a little further down, B, is where we talked about the visible evidence of wood destroying insects was observed as follows. And then you got your purple, your green, and your red arrows there. We talked about the live insects. You're going to need the description, location, the dead insects, insect parts, frass, shelter tubes, exit holes, and or staining. Once again, description, location. And then point 3, the red arrow, is visible damage from wood destroying insects was noted as follows. Once again, make sure you put the description and location. And then we had talked about below that, there's a spot that says this is not a structural damage report. If box B above is checked, it should be understood that some degree of damage, including hidden damage, may be present. If questions arise regarding damage indicated by this report, it is recommended that the buyer or any interested parties contact a qualified structural professional to determine the extent of damage and need for repairs. Once again, unless you're a structural engineer or at least a home inspector and you want to take on the liability, you're not a qualified structural professional just because you're licensed or certified to do these reports. That's something I would completely stay away from. The yellow arrow there down where it says yes or no, that's if it appears a portion of the structure may have been previously treated. You're going to need to put the visible evidence of the treatment in that line below there. So we talked about it, drill marks, monitoring systems, whatever the case may be, whatever tipped you off that there's actually been some treatment. And just remember, the blue arrow at the bottom shows a section that the inspecting company can give no assurances with regard to work done by other companies. The company that performed the treatment should be contacted for information on treatment and warranty or service agreement which may be in place. That's the area, as I told you, that kind of protects you from having to explain other people's work. We don't want to do that. We just want to put on there, yes, we feel like it has been treated, this is the evidence, or no, we don't see any evidence. Section 3 is also interesting. It kind of works in conjunction with Section 2. First box is going to say no treatment is recommended. If Section B is checked, you're going to have to explain why. So this takes us a little further down from Section 2, box B. If you check box A that says no active termites or visible evidence, then we're great. You can go ahead and check this box saying no treatment is recommended. If box B is checked and there is frass, shelter tubes, active termites, whatever, you are going to have to explain why. The letter states that you must give an explanation if box B is checked. So let's say you've seen some old staining, but you've seen no evidence of tubes or termites. You might put, hey, I saw some staining. There was no evidence of termites or tubes or anything else. There were some drill holes in the crawl space, so I feel pretty good that this has been treated once upon a time, and I feel like nothing that's left here is active, so I'm going to go ahead and not recommend treatment. The second box here says recommended treatment for the control of. Just make sure in this section that you write down, if it's subterranean termites, write down subterranean termites. If you're seeing some exit holes and some frass below them, some powder post beetles, then it would be for powder post beetles. If you're on the outside, you're seeing the little nice dime-sized shape holes in the siding or in the porch railing or whatever, that would obviously be the carpenter bees. So keep in mind, this is a pretty simple section, but it works in conjunction with Section 2, and you've got to remember, if that box B is checked, you're going to have to explain why you are not recommending treatment, even though there was some evidence that a wood-destroying insect has been there in the past. And I'll just take a quick second on this, but this is the actual Section 3 as it appears on the form. You can see the red arrow there is the section where it says no treatment recommended, and then explain if box B in Section 2 is checked. So that's pretty simple to fill out. And then, of course, the yellow arrow is where you mark recommended treatment for the control of. Once again, we just need to put what we saw that's active or there was evidence of, and then that's what we're going to need to recommend control for. Next, we need to take a look at Section 4, the obstructions and inaccessible areas of the termite letter. This is the most important part of the letter in my mind, because this is what builds in protections for you as the pest control company. It also gives the consumer an idea of what you actually saw in the structure and what the obstructions and inaccessible areas were, so there's no ambiguity later about, well, did you look in this area, did you see this, did you see that? This is what lets them know, hey, this is what I found and I couldn't view these areas because of this, or whatever the case may be. So as we look at the obstructions and inaccessible areas, there's a lot of different codes on here, but this is the section where you're going to need to mark, for instance, you've got number 1 in the basement. Well, number 1 basement on there, we need to look at what codes might be a problem. Code number 7 on the termite letter would be stored items. Well, how often do you go in a basement and see stored items everywhere? Quite often you do, and you're not able to view the walls. So that again would be an obstruction, and you would mark number 7 in the line next to basement. What about a suspended ceiling, code number 2 in a basement? Again, that's a pretty common thing. You're going to see a suspended ceiling in a basement. How about no access? There's areas in the basement that may be inaccessible, small little open room areas, things like that. Fixed wall covering, code number 3. That could be another one in a basement. Again, it's something else we could run into that's a problem. So keep in mind as we talk about the basements. Obviously, there's a lot of areas. Number 2, the crawl space. This is obviously going to be one of your biggest areas where you're going to have a problem. Number 1, we could have no access. Number 10, I'm going to talk about it more later, but on the back of the termite letter, but you got to keep in mind that no access means if it's less than 24 inches tall, it can be considered completely inaccessible, because the back of the letter says anything under 24 inches is completely inaccessible. That's important. How many crawl spaces have you been in where it's been shorter than 24 inches? Quite a few if you've been in this industry for a while. I could name numerous ones. I think it's important to note also that we're not just in the business to do the wood destroying insect reports or termite letters. We're in the business to get sales too. So if you can get in the crawl space, even if it's less than 24 inches, I would, because that's important for you to find termites. Maybe nobody else has been in that crawl space. That's going to give you a pretty good way to find termites, and you're not competing with anybody else because it's so small. Most companies probably say, yeah, you know what, I'm not going to crawl that. So that can be a great sales opportunity for you. Not to mention that wood's probably going to be more susceptible to termites as well, because it is closer to the actual ground level, and it's going to retain more moisture than wood would be if the crawl space was 3, 4, maybe even 5 feet tall. Another good one in the crawl space is going to be ductwork, etc., which is code number 24. There again, you're going to have ductwork running through there. Your main trunk of ductwork may be so low to the ground that you can't even get underneath it. I'm sure you've seen that plenty of times in your work doing termite letters. So obviously that's a major obstruction. But ductwork in general is a good obstruction to write down, because it's going to block view to some areas. And doing termite inspections, as I have for many, many years, the smallest of areas can be a big problem if you can't inspect it. That one little 3-inch tube can be a major problem. Another thing in the crawl space could be no access, code number 10. What if we just can't access the crawl space at all? Again, what if it's 8 inches off the ground? And I've seen those crawl spaces, especially in the older parts of town, where the homes have been there, probably since the 17 and 1800s in some cases. They just didn't do a really good job of digging out the crawl spaces deep enough for you to be able to access. So keep in mind, no access is a good code there. Also, no access could mean, and there's another code for this, but 15, standing water. If the crawl space is full of 6 or 8 inches of water, we don't need to go in the crawl spaces. We don't know where that water came from. We don't know if it's sewer water. We don't know the ins and outs of the origin of that water, and we sure don't need to be getting sick or just even getting our clothes soaking wet or whatever. Today, right now, I'm teaching this class. It's about 19 degrees out this morning. I'm not going in a crawl space if I'm a technician or an inspector at 19 degrees out and then coming outside. I'm either going to get frostbite or pneumonia or something like that. So keep in mind, standing water can be used as no access. I would use those codes kind of hand in hand. There's also a code for unsafe conditions. In the next slide, I'll show you the number on that. But unsafe conditions in a crawl space. What if there's old rusty metal down there and broken glass, trash. How many times have you seen that? I've seen foreclosed homes where people just literally threw their trash up under the crawl space for 2 or 3 months. I'm sure they knew they were going to be foreclosed on, and they actually just were doing it just to damage the property itself because they weren't very happy about the foreclosure or whatever the case may be. But keep in mind, that's another thing that can make it inaccessible or dangerous, and I would once again use the no access code and then hazardous conditions code. The main level also is very important. There's several codes on there. In the initial one, fixed ceiling would be number 1, fixed wall covering number 3. Almost every home you go into is going to have a drywall ceiling, drywall covering the walls. Well, guess what? That would make this structure an inaccessible area to view. You honestly have no idea what's going on behind those walls. And those of you that have dealt with termites know pretty quick that the home could be stucco on the outside, it could be brick veneer. And what does the stucco and the brick veneer do? It extends below grade. It's very easy for termites to come up between that brick veneer and the house structure itself, because the brick is independent from the house. The brick is actually laid on the footer and then built up, and then metal ties are put between the joints and the brick, and they're L-shaped, so the bottom part of the joint goes in the brick joint, and then the other L part is actually hammered to the structure itself, to the studs. So keep in mind that brick veneer, very easily termites can come up right from the outside. You could never see them in a crawl space or on the slab area. They could be inside that wall. I've seen cases where there'd just be little grits of sand on the wall on the spot, and you touch it and it'd be real soft, and sometimes even your finger might go right into the wall. So keep in mind that there may be some evidence of those termites, or there may not. So you've got to be aware that that fixed wall covering, that fixed ceiling blocks your whole view. You need to write those obstructions up. Number 7, stored items. That's another great one for the inside of the house. How often are we dealing with stored items, or even number 14, cluttered condition? How many homes have you been in where they got whole rooms stacked up with boxes wall to wall? These are inaccessible, obstructed areas. You've got to write that down, because what if the baseboards have some damage, or the window frame has some damage that's quite evident if the room was wide open? So when the buyer goes into this place, the buyer's going to see a totally different picture than you're seeing when they move into the house, because obviously the other people are going to be moved out. So these are some other really good protections for you to think about. An attic, number 4, is going to be the same thing. You got to remember, an attic's going to have insulation, things like that. So again, it can be pretty well obstructed. And some attics are so small you can't get in them anyways. And I know some people don't really inspect the attics on termite letters as well, because you are dealing with subterranean termites. But I again would write up some obstructions on there, at least to cover me a little bit. Probably the worst code I deal with is number 5, the garage. The garage is one of those areas where you almost always have some obstructions. I mean, how many people don't have a bunch of stored items in their garage? Code number 7, stored items, that's almost a staple in garages. Or number 14, cluttered condition. Once again, that's a very easy code to mark up almost every garage. I mean, unless the people have moved out of the house and it's sitting vacant, or it's a foreclosure, we're pretty much dealing with some stored items in a cluttered condition. Garages are probably the most susceptible area in a home to termites. I mean, in my experience, probably 60% of infestations I've ever found have actually been in the garage areas. So keep in mind, this is an area that can be your best friend or your worst enemy. You can get a lot of business by doing good inspections in garages, but you can also miss termites real easy if you don't do a thorough inspection and then write up your obstructions in that area. Once again, fixed ceiling in a garage, number 1, very common. Fixed wall covering in a garage is very common. I inspected a home about 3 years ago, found one little termite in a crawl space, and inspected the inside of the home, the garage, and everything. Didn't see anything else. I did write it up for treatment because I felt like it hadn't been treated. Well, come to find out, when the new homeowner moved in, they saw a little piece of sand or gritty stuff in the drywall, as I was just mentioning a minute ago. Well, he touched it, and his finger kind of went into the wall, and then he called us back out, and we actually opened the wall up. There was termites all on the runner stud at the bottom, and they had run up 3 studs inside the wall. Now, I mean, these were very active live termites. They were everywhere as soon as we started taking the drywall out. So just remember, it's very easily to get confused on doing a termite inspection or miss something, and you've got to be quite aware of those obstructions, and that fixed wall covering is probably one of my favorite ones in a garage area that kind of lets them know, hey, I really don't know what's going on behind that drywall. There can be a major termite infestation, and it's going to be pretty hard for you to find as an inspector. A little further down, number 6, the exterior. There again is another area that's kind of overlooked on termite inspections. I've inspected many homes through the years where I've seen termite tubes coming right up the outside. I know a lot of people in the industry think, no, that doesn't happen. I can promise you it does. Now, I've been doing this for 17 years, so I may have seen more homes than a lot of y'all have out there, but at the end of the day, I've seen multiple homes with termite tubes on the outside that maybe were in a shady area. maybe the hose pipe was leaking. If the hose pipe bib's leaking, I mean, that's going to give a great moisture source. I've seen it leaking, just on a drip rate, and big termite tubes building right up next to that hose pipe and actually going in around the pipe. So don't discount the exterior as a place that the termites can come up and you can have some issues. I always like code number 15 on the exterior. If I see some standing water, I'm marking that down, because what's more conducive to termites than standing water around the outside of a structure? If there's standing water, I feel pretty confident that there's going to be some termites in that area. Whether or not they've hit the house or not yet, it's hard for us to say. But we're in sales here too, and if you write down standing water and you write down even the code 16 dense vegetation, that's going to give you some opportunities to sell later. How many of you are actually sending postcards to the new homeowner when they move in, introducing yourself? How many of you are going back and knocking on the door? Well, this termite letter here is going to give you some ammunition to talk to them about in sales, because you're going to be able to say, hey, when I was out here, seen some pretty major standing water around the outside of the property. Or this dense vegetation you've got growing on the outside of the structure, that's going to make it real easy for termites to nest in those areas. The soil's loose from the standing water, or insects themselves. I mean, if you got dense vegetation, how many of you are pretty convinced that you're going to have some other insect problems as well? You've got a nice little environment and habitat for them. And a lot of times the previous owner was probably watering these areas as well, which again is going to draw in the termites and the insects. And the dense vegetation too, it's another issue if it's growing around the crawl space vents, because what is that doing to the airflow? I mean, it's restricting that airflow. Restricting the airflow is a big problem. I mean, the whole idea of a ventilation system in a crawl space is that the air will actually flow through and kind of reduce the moisture down there, so it doesn't completely cling to the floor joist and the pores of the wood don't actually take in or absorb all that moisture. So keep in mind, dense vegetation around the outside is a pretty conducive condition for termites. So just wanted to let you know, make sure you don't discount the exterior and just write it off, because it is one of those areas that can be a big problem. Number 7 on our list here, the porch. The thing about the porch is it is going to be a tough area to inspect. Obviously, there's going to be some obstructions on it. How many of you have been underneath a crawl space where the porch area is kind of open underneath? You've probably seen quite a few of those, I'm sure. How often have you found termites in those areas? I've seen them a lot. I've seen a lot of times like form boards where they actually poured the porch and they left the forms underneath the house. About a year and a half ago, I was under a home where they left the form boards in, actually a 2x4 stud going straight to the soil, and then there was a cross stud at the top kind of supporting that porch when they poured it. Well, guess what had happened? The house was probably 12, maybe 15 years old. The termites had come right up those form boards and had just ravaged them. It was the only place in the whole crawl space I actually saw any termites. But that was enough that, of course, I had to write up termite infestation needed to be controlled, because there was actually live termites in those form boards. So the thing about the porch is you want to keep in mind, most of them are going to be backfilled, and as we know, scrap lumber, debris, cardboard boxes, empty beer cases. I mean, how often do you see people drinking on a construction site? And, it's kind of funny how, they're drinking while they're building the houses, which is a separate issue, but they're throwing their empty beer cases underneath that porch in that scrap area. Well, guess what that is? That's cellulose. Anything that's a paper type of material, whether it's scrap lumber, whether it's cardboard box, empty beer cases, whatever the case may be, that's cellulose. That's feeding those termites. How often do you come back to those homes and actually see termites swarming around the front porch area? I've seen it many times through the years. It's a very common thing. So we've got to keep in mind that the porch, in as much as you may not be able to write up a ton of obstructions on it, but you can't view what's going on underneath that backfilled porch. So just keep in mind that's an area you especially want to take a look at. Just make sure there's no evidence of swarmers. I mean, very easily, if it's in the springtime, even if you didn't catch the actual swarm itself, you can still see some dead swarmers around the porch area pretty easy there, maybe even for a few weeks thereafter. So the porch is another area that can be a problem. Additions can also be a problem. It depends how they're built. If they're built on a slab, Obviously, you've got an expansion joint. We've talked about them in the garages as well. Anywhere you've got an expansion joint, very easy for the termites to come up. And also very easy for you to miss the termites, because a lot of times that expansion joint, maybe there's concrete coming up, 3-4 inches, and then it goes straight to the drywall. So keep in mind, whether it's the garage or an addition, you've got an expansion joint, and termites need about 1/64 of an inch to come up in an area. So once again, there may be some special obstructions in this area, but generally, your fixed wall covering, your fixed ceiling, so on and so forth, definitely are going to be a problem in those areas as well. This is actually the visual of section 4. And I just want to show you, we talked about, over where my red arrow is here, the different areas of the home that we're inspecting. And then on the right there, the yellow arrow kind of gives you codes of what the actual obstructions or inaccessible areas may be. So just keep in mind, we talked about the basement, the crawl space, so on and so forth. Make sure you put an X in those boxes on the left, any of the areas that have obstructions or inaccessible areas, and then bring over the corresponding code with it there. I would also suggest, anytime you're doing this, for liability issues, I would strongly say take pictures of those areas, especially if it's something out of the way that's not standard or customary, because there's always going to be those situations where something's really covered up, or an area you just couldn't get to. If you take a picture of it, it's going to give a better visual, especially if you end up in court. And I don't know that you're ever going to get there, but I can tell you, the more documentation, the more pictures, and the more paperwork you have, the more protection you're going to have in court. And let's be honest, most people are getting anywhere from $35 to $125 for a termite inspection. So it's not like we're getting rich off these things, and the last thing we need is liability dragging us down on a service that technically we're not really getting paid what we should for anyway. But this is what the section 4 looks like. There's the obstructions, inaccessible areas on the left with the red arrow. There's your codes on the right with the yellow arrow. Make sure you use these, and make sure, owners and managers, you're training your people well in this area. We don't have to spend a lot of time on section 5, but it is an important part of the letter. As it says, additional comments and attachments are going to be an integral part of the report. Well, I can just tell you right now, your comments and attachments in this area, attachments, obviously you're going to add the graph in the back, which we talked about. You're going to note if you're seeing any activity, maybe even some of the conducive conditions. You can put codes for that on there. Additional comments, I would just put in this area something that, pertains to the inspection itself, like couldn't view any walls in the garage due to cluttered condition. So, I may write that right on the bottom in that area, even though I put it in section 4 as well, because I think section 5 just kind of sums things up. Or termite activity was found in spare bedroom, or termite activity in the master bathroom, whatever the case may be. Keep in mind, this is an integral part of the report, and you need to mark some things down in this area. And this is something else, again, that just covers you on some of the liability issues. But I really like to put down things that are important in this area, because to fill out a report completely, you need to definitely use this box for things that are a pretty big deal. And here is a picture of the section 5, and like I said, this corresponds with what I was just saying to you. But again, keep in mind that right there where it says section 5, additional comments and attachments being an integral part of the report, there's the lines you go ahead and put on there. This is what I found, this is my obstructions, this is what I'm concerned about. The attachments part, I would think maybe on that you may just put something like, a graph is attached on the back, or something like that, or maybe even a picture or a photo or something like that. Usually I think the signature of the sellers and the buyers, usually that's taken care of on the real estate side, so usually that's not something that we're too involved in on our side. Just keep in mind, this is an important part of the letter, and I don't want you to pass this and think that it's not a problem. Let's look at the heading of page 2. I think this is an important part of the termite letter, So I kind of went right to the picture on this one because I thought, it's pretty self-explanatory in what it says. But this is going to be important consumer information regarding the scope and limitations of the inspection. And it states, please read this entire page as it is part of the report. This report is not a guarantee or warranty as to the absence of wood-destroying insects, nor is it a structural integrity report. The inspector's training and experience do not qualify the inspector in damage evaluation or any other building construction, technology, and or repair. So if you remember back earlier when we were looking at page 1 of the termite letter, we had some protections in there that says we're not inspectors of damage evaluation, structural engineers. We don't really need to be talking about actual damage to the structure because once again we're not qualified, and it's just a real slippery slope and one we don't need to go down unless you are a certified structural engineer or at least a home inspector, as some of you that do this probably are. But keep in mind, unless you have some other certifications, stay away from that because it's just going to get you into trouble. It also says this is not a guarantee or warranty as to the absence of wood destroying insects. I would say that usually most states have a 90-day guarantee, so I would say it is sort of a warranty because of that 90-day guarantee. But once again, on the other side, we marked our obstructions and inaccessible areas that will at least help cover us on the areas that we couldn't inspect. Okay, let's take a look at section 1 of page 2 on the termite letter. This is the area that's going to tell you about the inspections, what it covers, and tells you a little bit about the warranty and things like that. Let's kind of take this from the top, the red arrow there by number 1 that says about the inspection. It says a visual inspection was conducted in the readily accessible areas of the structures indicated on page 1, including attics and crawl spaces, which permitted entry during the inspection. The inspection included probing and or sounding of unobstructed and accessible areas to determine the presence or absence of visible evidence of wood-destroying insects. The wood-destroying insect inspection firm is not responsible to repair any damage or treat any infestation at the structures inspected, except as may be provided in a separate contract. Also, wood-destroying insect infestation and or damage may exist in concealed or inaccessible areas. The inspection firm cannot guarantee that any wood-destroying insect infestation and or damage disclosed by this inspection represents all of the wood-destroying insect infestation and or damage which may exist as the date of the inspection. Let's stop right there. That's a lot of information to chew up all at once. Just remember that first line, a visual inspection was conducted in the readily accessible areas of the structure. So once again, that's where your obstructions and inaccessible areas come in that you wrote up, because the visual inspection was only conducted in the ones that were readily accessible. So once again, you're covered with the areas you said were obstructed. The inspection also included probing or sounding of unobstructed and accessible areas to determine the presence of wood-destroying insects. Keep in mind, this is going to be during your termite inspections, and I don't know how many of you have done this, where you tap on the baseboards or window frames or wood to see if it sounds hollow. So keep in mind that's something you need to be doing, because it does say on here that we actually will do that. It also says the wood-destroying insect inspection firm is not responsible to repair any damage or treat any infestation at the structures inspected. So we're not liable for any damage or needing to treat anything unless it says so in a separate contract. So this is not making you liable to do any treatment at all. Obviously, the next line says that some infestation or damage may occur in concealed or inaccessible areas, and we've talked about that. We've written those up on the other side. The inspection firm cannot guarantee that any wood-destroying insect infestation and or damage disclosed in this inspection represents all of the damage or activity in the house at the date of the inspection. That's good, because you'll remember earlier in the class, I found some in a crawl space one time that didn't look that bad. Come to find out later, there was some hidden damage in the garage that I never could have seen because it was behind the drywall. So just keep in mind, this is saying that obviously we found some activity. There may be more activity we can't see, especially if you got active termites in a house. We really truly don't know what all the areas are that they're infesting without doing some probing or digging into the walls. Second red arrow there, and you'll see this is kind of in bold face and underline. It says For purposes of this inspection, wood-destroying insects are going to include termites, carpenter ants, carpenter bees, and reinfesting wood-borne beetles. This inspection does not include mold, mildew, or non-insect wood-destroying organisms. Obviously, we need to stop there real quick because this is important. Most people are not aware that the 4 insects included on this are the termite, the carpenter ant, the carpenter bee, and a wood-boring beetle. This is important because how many times have you done your termite inspection, walked around the outside, seen some evidence of carpenter bees, whether it was holes, frass, or whatever, and you didn't mark it up? Most state inspectors in most states are obviously going to tell you that you're in violation if you haven't done this. Once again, every state's different. You need to check your state laws. But I would say if the letter says it, it's pretty much the law because this is the standard letter used for most states in the country. And I know some states have addendums to it as well. So you really need to know what your state's looking for. But I would never go through a house and see termites, carpenter ant evidence, of course, the frass, the ants being ejected, maybe dead ants, some galleries, whatever it may be, carpenter bee activity or reinfesting wood-borne beetles like some frass and the exit holes. I would always mark those things up because those are the 4 things that the report says. And if you ever do go to court or anything on this, you're going to need to be protected and say, hey, I wrote down everything I saw. The next line says this inspection does not include mold, mildew, or non-insect wood-destroying organisms. This is extremely important. This is not a mold, mildew inspection. I know most people look at it in our industry and say, hey, this is a great opportunity for me to sell a borate treatment or maybe a scrub down, whatever you're looking to do. That's a great idea. Just don't include that on this report. I would suggest probably not saying that to the buyer as well because you really need to tell the buyer's agent first. Obviously, that can help you get some work later, so we're all in sales, we're here to make money, so definitely something you want to mention, but you don't want to mention it to the buyer themselves. There's also some ideas of disclosure too, so you may want to figure out with your real estate agents beforehand and say, hey, if I see mold, mildew, so on and so forth, etc., do you want me to mention it to you? Because then they pretty much are going to have to disclose it to their buyer, which they should want to protect their buyer as well. So I think that would be a good idea, but you just never know. I mean, let's face it, real estate agents have all got different ideas about this, and their goal is to close the deal because if they don't, they're not making any money. The other part of this just says the report is obviously not construed as a 90-day warranty, but it is good for 90 days. So to me, that's just saying this report is good for 90 days, and it's good for mortgage purposes and other things like that. It says obviously securing a mortgage and or settlement of property, it has to be used within 90 days. So keep in mind it's going to be 90 days, and I think most states go along with that, so no matter what state you're in, you should be pretty good with that. I want to quickly touch on Section 2 on page 2. It says Treatment Recommendation Guidelines regarding subterranean termites. FHA and VA require treatment when any active infestation of subterranean termites is found. And I think that's pretty simple because anytime we find any active infestation, we're going to mark up that it needs to be treated anyway. The next line says, if signs of subterranean termites but no activity are found in a structure that shows no evidence of having been treated for subterranean termites in the past, then a treatment should be recommended. So anytime you see staining, a shelter tube, some damage, whatever the case may be, if there's no evidence of treatment for FHA and VA, you're going to need to mark that up, recommended for treatment. And this is important because I don't think most of us ever think to read this area or look at this. That's a sales opportunity for you because you may not have marked up staining on a standard conventional mortgage letter, but for FHA and VA you're going to need to. So again, that's a great sales opportunity for us out there in the field. It also says a treatment may be recommended for a previously treated structure showing evidence of subterranean termites but no activity if there is no documentation of a liquid treatment by a licensed pest control company within the previous 5 years, and unless the structure is presently under warranty or covered by a service agreement with a licensed pest control company. So once again, you may see some evidence, staining, tubes, whatever, no activity, but if there's no documentation of a treatment by a licensed company in the past 5 years on the FHA and VA letters, you're going to need to recommend treatment again. I think this is an important section because I think it gives us another opportunity to sell, and also we're following the guidelines. So if we don't follow the guidelines, once again, we could have an issue in court, and really we want to be protected at all costs. Section 3 on page 2, the obstructions in inaccessible areas. I know we've talked a lot about, the obstructions and inaccessible areas, and I don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but I just want to note that after the instructions in inaccessible areas, it says no inspection was made in areas which required the breaking apart or into, dismantling, removal of any object, including but not limited to moldings, floor coverings, wall coverings, siding, fixed ceilings, insulation, furniture, appliances, and or personal possessions. Nor were areas inspected which were obstructed or inaccessible for physical access at the date of the inspection. So once again, this goes a little further with your obstructions and actually what those codes mean and how it protects you as an inspector or company. It also says your inspector may write out inaccessible areas or use the key in section 4. Crawl spaces, attics, and or other areas may be deemed inaccessible if the opening area is not large enough to provide physical access for the inspector or if a ladder was required for access. Let's just quickly stop there, because if you can't get in through some of these attic doors, it's going to be an obstructed, inaccessible area, as well as if you need a ladder to get up in there, that again is an inaccessible area. So that's something you can real easily write up and have yourself covered. Also, we want to note that crawl spaces may also be deemed inaccessible if there is less than 24 inches of clearance from the bottom of the floor joist to the surface below. If any area which has been reported as inaccessible is made accessible, the inspection company may be contacted for another inspection. An additional fee may apply. We mentioned a little bit earlier, if there's less than 24 inches from the bottom of those floor joists to the ground, then we need to mark that up as inaccessible. Or, as I said, if there's any way you can get in there, it's a great idea to go in there and inspect, because at the end of the day, you may be the only person that's been in there in 10-15 years, and it's a pretty good chance you're going to find some termites and be able to bid on the termite treatment. It's important to note, too, that if any area has been reported as inaccessible is made accessible, the company may be contacted for another inspection. An additional fee may apply. Well, I'm charging an additional fee. I don't know about you, but let's say I'm getting, $75 on a termite letter. I don't want to have to go back for free because they didn't have the structure prepped for me to do it. So I would definitely go back out and do it. I mean, obviously the letter tells us legally we have to, but I would not be shy at all about charging them again, because that would, to me, would be another service call for your company. Section 4 is also very interesting. It says consumer maintenance advisory regarding integrated pest management for the prevention of wood-destroying insects. Any structure can be attacked by wood-destroying insects. Homeowners should be aware of and try to eliminate conditions which promote insect infestation in and around their structures. Factors which may lead to wood-destroying insect infestation include earth-to-wood contact, foam insulation at foundation in contact with the soil, faulty grade, improper drainage, firewood against structures, insufficient ventilation, moisture, wood debris in the crawl space, wood mulch or ground cover in contact with the structure, tree branches touching the structure, landscape timbers, and wood decay. Should these or other conditions exist, corrective measures should be taken in order to reduce the chances of infestation of wood-destroying insects and the need for treatment. This area of the letter, to me, screams sales. This is the area that I can go. I can find problems that make a home conducive to the termites themselves. And I can come back later as I wrote those problems up, and I can even tell the customer, hey, these are the things that are conducive conditions. These are the things that need to be fixed, which maybe my company would charge a fee and fix some of these things. Or we need to do some preventative type of treatment for termites or other wood-destroying insects because these conditions exist. If you're going to look at a crawl space and there's some moisture in there, some standing water, or you just seen a lot of condensation on the ductwork, maybe you've seen some of the fungi or mold growing, This is great because you can come back to the customer and say, hey, part of the inspection we did, I didn't know if you've seen on section 4 that these are the things we found that were a problem, and we want to talk to you about it because we really think you're going to need some type of protection on this home for termites, moisture, whatever the case may be. Once again, to end this thing off, I just want to let you know, we're all in sales. We're all out there to make money. Without sales, nothing happens in this industry. Every time you go to a home, a sale had to be executed or you're not doing a treatment. This is a great section and a great tool to help you get some of those sales and help the homeowners get the structure the way they want it and keep their home protected. Because remember, this is the biggest investment generally they're going to make in their life. So they're going to want to protect their homes. It's up to you to explain the how and why and then close the deal. Let's go over a quick review. Termite letters are a great way to grow your business. Termite letters also are going to carry a lot of liability. It's your responsibility to train your team to be thorough on the termite letters, to make sure all sections are filled out, and know what protections are built in for you and your company.